Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 77, Life is a Dream, Pedro Calderon de la Barca. Last time, I took you through some examples of the plays by Lope de Vega, he who dominated the Spanish stage during the Renaissance period. He was a man who stood out amongst the many playwrights of the time, but he was not alone in standing out. With the perspective of time, we can look back and say that while his achievements were not closely rivalled, there was one man who came demonstrably closest to taking Lope's crown than any other. But that did not happen until the very end of what we now see as the golden age of Spanish theatre. So let's meet the rival to Lope de Vega, Pedro Calderon de la Barca. Calderon's life spanned all but 20 years of the 17th century. Born in 1600 in Madrid, he was the son of a secretary to the court treasury, whose wife had some ancestral links to the Flemish aristocracy. He was another early achiever, and began tuition at the Jesuit school aged just 8. His mother died in childbirth a couple of years later, his father quickly remarried and then died the year after, so by the age of 15, young Pedro and his 3 siblings was in the care of a stepmother. There was a lengthy dispute between the stepmother and the children over the family legacy, but this was eventually settled with an endowment to each of the children that left them financially secure. Pedro took advantage of this by taking up a place at university, where he studied theology and canon law, but also began to write poetry and plays. His first effort, called The Chariot of Heaven, is lost, but by the age of 20 he had decided on a literary career and abandoned his other studies. 2 years later, he won a poetry competition held in Madrid and earned praise from Lope de Vega himself, then at the height of his powers. In the summer of 1621, Calderon was accused, along with his brothers, of murdering the servant of the High Constable in Madrid. They were convicted, but only suffered a fine for their crime, which says a lot about the life of young men in Madrid at the time and the state of the legal system. The details are vague, but just a fine for murder seems, well, lenient at least. It was not to be his last brush with the law. There's some indication that about the same time he collaborated on a couple of plays with other playwrights, but his first solo credit was in 1623, when he penned an adaptation of a published story called Love, Honour and Power. Just as he was starting to show real literary promise, he volunteered for army service and saw action in Italy and Flanders before being sent to Catalonia as part of a force charged with putting down a local revolt. He was wounded in the hand, but also seems to have been present at the surrender at Breda in the Spanish Netherlands in 1624. If not present, he was certainly well aware of the details, which appear in his play from the following year, The Siege of Breda, which was written soon after the end of that particular incident, which was part of the 80 Years' War with the Spanish provinces in the Low Countries that wasn't fully resolved until 1648. The taking of Breda was seen as a significant Spanish victory at the time and something for Spanish patriots to celebrate. After his military service, the next time Calderon turns up is again in court records. Now 25, it seems that he went to help his brother, who had been wounded in a fight with an actor. In the kind of reaction that was to be expected of a young man at the time, he rushed to defend the family honour and sought out the attacker, who was hiding in a convent. Calderon rushed into the sanctuary, and the nuns cried foul, suggesting that they had been molested by the intruder. Calderon was taken before the court and received an official rebuke. The final outcome of the issues of honour between him and the actor, if there was one, is not recorded, but he got his own back on the court prosecutor in his next play, The Constant Prince, where he effectively parodies the pompous and hectoring style of legal language. That may have been personally satisfying, but the incident had lasting effects. In the face of rising political unrest, the court decided to use the incident as a pretext to attack playwrights in general as a disruptive influence. Within a few years, the atmosphere for playwriting had become more restrictive and plays subject to more censorship than had been the case since the turn of the century. By the time he entered his 30s, Calderon was moving comfortably in aristocratic circles thanks to his good family origins, and had acquired several patrons that allowed him to write full-time and in various forms. His output may not have matched Lope de Vega's, but it was nevertheless impressive. 300 plays are credited to his pen, of which about 100 comedias and 80 auto sacramental are extant. He also wrote several zaruzelas, that uniquely Spanish form that was a mix of mask musical theatre and the comic play, which integrated singing and dancing. In his early career, he wrote mostly cape and sword plays, melodramas really, that were then at the height of their popularity. The Spanish audience lapped up romantic stories that were full of dramatic and exciting action sequences. The stories were based on the struggles of the younger generation against the tyranny of older family members, fathers and uncles who tried to exert their will against the course of true love amongst their children and wards. The plays featured complex plots that became more and more tortuous as the action progressed, and ruses in the name of romance and misunderstandings between characters heaped one upon the other and became more and more complex. They were plays designed to be enjoyable fun, but also had a moral core, so family honour and the course of true love always triumphed. Usually at the last moment, when all the complications were suddenly understood thanks to some coincidental event. The female characters feature heavily as questions of honour are raised and eventually resolved. But they are not just objects of the plot. In many plays they actively engage in the intrigues and manipulate the men to ensure that they obtain the object of their desire. Titles from plays from 1629, The Phantom Lady and A House with Two Doors is Difficult to Guard, give a sense of the excitement that these plays of intrigue, romance and action generated. Many of these plays have threads of outright comedy running through them, but Calderon also had a serious side and turned out several historical dramas that, while not necessarily being historically accurate, sought to convey ideas about how rulers and those with social advantage by birth should behave, which was all very much an extension of the honour culture that featured so strongly in Spanish culture at the time. There is one type of play where Calderon excels, even when he is compared to Lope de Vega. He produced a group of plays that tackled philosophical themes, and the best of these is his 1632 play, Life is a Dream. Not only does it return to one of his favourite questions, how should a leader rule justly, but also asks questions about the amount of free will that common men should and do have, and, if that were not enough, about the nature of reality itself. The play opens with a sight that has become familiar to the Spanish audience in plays of intrigue, a woman dressed as a man. This is Rosaura, who has just been thrown from her horse. She laments her bad luck to her servant, and he can only agree. But then he spots a distant building right at the top of the mountain that they are currently halfway up. They investigate the building, finding it crude and ramshackle, but not, as they had expected, deserted. They hear the scraping of a chain, and at first think ghosts populate the place, but then find a half-alive man chained to a wall of a cell. As they listen to his rambling speech, they understand that he has no idea why he has been imprisoned so. He compares himself to the birds and the beasts that he glimpses from the window in his cell, as he longs to enjoy the same freedom that they do. He vocalises a main theme of the play when he berates the powers of justice or reason that are capable of denying man the sweet privilege, the fundamental licence that God grants to crystalline waters, to fish, to beasts, and to the birds. Moved by his speech, Rosaura speaks to him, but he only responds with threats and the promise of violence. She continues to reason with him until his attitude starts to change, and they find some empathy in their shared misfortunes. Rosaura is starting to tell her story when Clothold, the man's jailer, arrives, followed by soldiers. Held by the soldiers for trespass, Rosaura explains that she has come to Poland to avenge a dishonour. She hands Clothold her sword, which he looks at long and hard before asking her how she came by it. In an aside, he says that the sword was once his, and proves that this young man is his son. Clothold has been charged by the king to bring the prisoner to court, and he agrees to bring Rosaura with him and help the young man avenge this dishonour. At the palace, Aistulf, the Duke of Muscovy, is courting Princess Stella, who resists his advances despite the threat of violence that exudes from him. She sees a locket with a lady's portrait that he carries with him and questions his intentions towards her if he still loves another. He avoids answering the question directly and makes it clear that as Stella's uncle the king is widowed and childless, and that they both have ambitions to power, a marriage contract between them would be advantageous to them both. The king arrives, and in a long monologue explains that his advancing age means that he needs to unburden a secret that he has held for years. He explains that when his wife was pregnant 20 years ago, he read the astrology for the unborn child, and saw that he would become a threat to him. So he built a remote prison, and as soon as the child was born, he placed him in it, with just a jailer for company. He admits that with the passing of time he's come to realise that this was not a good plan, and he has resolved to bring his son home to court to test him. If he proves to be prudent, rational and benevolent, then he will restore his birthright to him. But if he turns out to be the menace that the astrology predicted, then he will be returned to his prison without a further thought, and he will allow the Duke and his niece to marry and rule. Clothold approaches the king with Rosaura and explains how this young man, through being bold and ignorant, entered the prison and saw the prince. The king gives his pardon, as his secret is now known to the court. As the king leaves, Rosaura thanks Clothold and swears allegiance to him. Still unaware of Rosaura's true sex, he asks who the object of her revenge is. She says it is none other than Duke Aistulf, but Clothold cannot believe this, saying that the Duke is incapable of such behaviour. Rosaura says obliquely that her external trappings are but a riddle, leaving Clothold confused. The king and Clothold discuss the arrival of the king's son Sigismund, who has been drugged so that he can be carried to the palace. The prince is still sleeping off the drug in the finely appointed rooms that have been prepared for him. The king instructs Clothold to tell the prince everything as soon as he wakes. And as he waits, Bugle, Rosaura's servant, tells him that, emboldened by his support, she has thrown off her manly disguise and declared herself to the court as his niece. Unsettled by this news, Clothold has to turn his attention to the prince, who has just been brought in. He is understandably confused by his location, the finery, and all the attention he is receiving. Clothold's more reverential attitude towards him just increases his confusion, but eventually he understands that he is in fact a prince of the realm, and that all he has to do is to overcome the prediction of the stars to claim his inheritance. Sigismund struggles with this information and erupts with anger, calling Clothold a sycophant, a savage, and a traitor to the law. As Clothold makes a hasty retreat, he suggests to the prince that all of this is just a dream. Aistulf and Stella enter, and unsure of how to behave, Sigismund is brusque with the former and over-familiar with the latter. The argument over the offence he has caused ends with a fight, and Sigismund throwing a servant over the balcony just as the king enters. The king sees only the threat to his person that Sigismund seems to offer, while Sigismund accuses the king of denying him his humanity. The entrance of Rosaura, now dressed as a woman, takes the heat out of the argument. Sigismund is distracted by her beauty, while she cannot comprehend how one so highborn has come so low. Sigismund interprets her feelings as love, but Rosaura, while not rejecting him, is decidedly cool towards him. Clothold enters and thinks that Sigismund is threatening Rosaura's honour, and after many verbal threats, the two men fight. Aistulf enters and joins the fight, and it is only when the king steps in that the violence can be stopped. The king blames his son and says that he will be sent back to his prison, as he is obviously untamable. Sigismund is taken off, and the king commands that he be drugged again and taken back to his prison, where he can then believe that the events at the palace were nothing but a dream. Aistulf observes that the astrologer's harshest predictions will always come true, as Rosaura and Stella enter. Stella realises that Rosaura is the woman in the portrait in the Duke's locket, and finally rejects the Duke's advances. Back in his prison, Sigismund is still to wake from his drugged sleep when the king arrives in disguise to spy on him. When the prince wakes, Clothold plays his part by asking about his dreams. But the recollections of the palace and the desire for vengeance leave Sigismund confused to the point at which he begins to question reality itself. He cannot be sure what is real and what is a dream, the palace or the prison. He contemplates the meaning of life. As he puts it, is life but a vain hope? A shadow, a fiction? Is all life a dream, and even dreams just dreams within dreams? The third act of the play opens with soldiers arriving at the prison looking for Sigismund. When they find him, they ask him to return to the court to restore order. The king has appointed the Duke of Muscovy as his successor, but the soldiers will not accept a foreigner as their ruler while a legitimate heir still lives. Sigismund is concerned that this is just another dream, but they persuade him to join them. When they bring Clotho to him, who swears his loyalty to the king, Sigismund spares his life, saying that he will do what is right, even if it is all a dream. The king and the duke discuss the difficulties in the kingdom since the new succession has been announced. Aistulf promises strong and violent action in response, and the king is informed of Sigismund's release. Rosora finds Clothold now returned to the palace and reminds him of his commitment to help her recover her honour. He tries to persuade her otherwise without admitting that he is her father, but she resolves to kill the duke. In the countryside near the prison, Rosora meets Sigismund and delivers a long monologue on the importance of honour and how she has to act as a lovesick woman to plead for help and as a man to win respect. While admitting that he longs for her, Sigismund is confused as to how he should respond if he were to become king. He leaves his response to her ambiguous, saying that honour demands that he has to be cruel to her now in order to be merciful to her later. The king and the duke enter. Retreating from Sigismund's soldiers, they admit they are defeated. The king prepares himself for death, kneeling to his son when he arrives, saying that the predictions had all been proved right. Sigismund responds by speaking of the importance of prudence and temperance, and warns about a belief in the ability to predict the future or trying to control a perceived danger. He ends his speech by recognising that through natural order he is inferior to his father and places himself at the king's mercy. Seeing the nobility in this action, the king rewards him with the crown. His first act as king is to command Aistulf to marry Rosora, so that her honour can be restored, and he takes Stella for his own wife. He pardons Clothold, recognising that he was loyal to his king, but orders jail for the soldiers who released him from his own imprisonment because they betrayed their king. Everyone is amazed by the change of character in Sigismund, and as the play ends, he explains that his teacher was a dream, from which he learned that forgiveness should come naturally from noble souls. Ideas of duty and honour resonate throughout the play from beginning to end, so although there are other thoughtful and serious questions in the play, it's clear that Calderon and his audience had lost none of their love of the cloak and dagger play. Rosora, in her male disguise, damaged but still bold and trying to control her own future, is also a typical element of this type of play. As we saw Lope de Vega merging comedy and tragedy, so too we see Calderon trying to take the cloak and dagger play to a new level by bringing in philosophical content, while also trying to include a strong thread of exciting action and some comedy. Rosora clearly has our sympathies, but her father's role is more ambivalent. He is loyal, but that loyalty means he does bad things over a long period of time. And yet his reaction to the discovery of his daughter is essentially a caring one. Being seen as a person of some deep and thoughtful feelings was a positive character trait that would have been appreciated by the audience, making him a more complex character than he appears at first. Every character has a question of honour that they have to satisfy. For the women, Rosora's need to restore her honour is obvious from her earlier defilement by the Duke. But Stella's is less so. She is shown as an ambitious female, making the audience reaction to her somewhat ambivalent. But through her questioning of the Duke to understand his true intentions, to be sure that his actions will be honourable, she establishes an honourable position for herself. The fact that they can agree to marry without love is not a failing on their part. This is the age where the marriages of royalty and the aristocracy were understood to be for political alliance and expediency. Nobody would expect to see such people marrying for love. For Sigismund, we would now say that his human rights had been seriously ignored, but Calderon would have seen this a little differently, as a question of honour, showing that his innate honour had been denied. His Act 1 speech, while chained to the prison wall, focuses on honour, covering familiar territory for the audience, but in the second act, the emphasis changes. Act 2 is where the play turns more philosophical. The king's plan to disguise the events at the palace as a dream tries to set up questions about the nature of reality and perception. It is no surprise that Sigismund is shown as being very confused by his changing situations, and Calderon is not quite brave enough to throw that philosophical question out directly to the audience. However, the theme does reflect philosophical thought that was beginning to emerge and would build later in the century in the works of philosophers like René Descartes, with the succinct "I think, therefore I am," and his followers who employed the Cartesian system. Sigismund's radical thoughts about which reality to believe in, if any, puts him in a bracket with those later philosophers. Radical doubt, a hallmark of the Cartesian philosophical system, is one of his central characteristics. And as if he did not have enough to ponder on, Sigismund's experiences as the son of a king, a man ruled by the movements of the stars and the planets, questions the existence of free will. A powerful belief in fate has motivated the king to make some of his cruelest decisions. But those decisions also reflect his belief that he can somehow impact fate by hiding his son away. He should realise that both these things cannot be true, and his attempt to alter fate will fail. But those beliefs are tempered and confused by his beliefs in his own temporal powers. It's worth remembering that by Calderon's time, the Catholic Church had long recognised that astrology could predict events and measure one's inclinations, so this thread is not as unorthodox as it may seem. The third act shows us the big change in Sigismund. We had a hint of his innate nobility in Act 2, but now, through his rewarding of loyalty, punishment of treason, even though it benefited him personally, and the mercy he shows towards his father, he shows that he understands the importance of doing the right thing, whatever the situation and however fleeting reality might be. This is contrasted in the Duke of Muscovy, who shows no change in his character throughout the play. Having dishonoured Rosora, he is eventually forced to marry her, but he only does so when assured that she is of noble birth. He's always trying to hide his true motivations from the woman he courts. Any other playwrights would surely have killed him off at the end of the play. Instead, Calderon leaves us with their rather dissatisfying union, and surely the potential for future problems in the kingdom, as he has to watch Stella become queen without him. The difficulty with the Duke's character is just one of the flaws in the play. For all its points of interest, there are several problems. Sigismund's transformation from the near bestial to a man of sophisticated thought in a matter of days is quite unbelievable, but in Calderon's defence, we have to remember that this is a fantasy play, and clearly so, and we should not expect realism. Other problems are that sections of the more didactic parts of the play are repetitive and consequently rather overlong, and the Rosaria Astolf subplot simply treads a well-known storyline and adds little to the more important themes of the play. Quite why the Duke, who had taken Rosora by force and then abandoned her, carries her portrait in the locket with him is never explained. Nevertheless, some critics have found much to like in the character of Rosora, who they compare to Shakespeare's heroines, and for some, such a powerful and central role is an indication that Calderon believed in equality for the sexes on stage. That may be a step too far, but at least at the end of the play Calderon was brave enough to avoid the neatly tied-up happy ending that was so common at the time. It is as if Calderon is driving home the point that the complexities about existence discussed in the play cannot be easily resolved. There is doubt and some unhappiness in the ending, and that in itself can be pleasing. Although Calderon had many plays performed at the chorales for the general public, he wrote with the court and the aristocracy in mind. The fact that the play references the Oedipus myth, with the king trying to avert the outcomes of a prophecy with disastrous results, would not have been lost on his educated audience. That reference to the classics may also have saved the play from royal censure. The portrayal of the king is hardly flattering, but then again, it was a king of Poland, not Spain, and clearly modelled on Oedipus, so any thought that this could be a commentary on the effectiveness of the current Spanish monarchy could be shrugged off. Which was just as well, as Calderon was about to move firmly in royal circles. The death of Lope de Vega in 1635 left a vacancy not only for the position of Spain's greatest living playwright, but more practically for the post of director of court entertainments. Despite his relative youth, Calderon was appointed to the position, and just a year later he was made a Knight of the Order of Santiago by the king. The official opening of the new Buenaventurio Palace afforded him a lavish setting to plan for, and his presentations for the opening ceremony, which included a floating stage on a lake, were very well received by the king. When all knights were called up to put down a rebellion in Catalonia, the king expressly forbade his departure from court. But as a loyal patriot, he finished his latest play in a week and left to join the army. He continued to write plays in a variety of genres. There was a series of plays that studied moral dilemmas via the honour code, but were rooted in rather more realistic situations than we find in If Life Were a Dream. The largest part of his output came when he was court poet, but this is now seen as his less interesting work. In that position, he had to adapt to the changing tastes of the time and a very religious court, so he produced hundreds of auto sacramental, the short religious plays that emerged at the end of the medieval period. About 80 of Calderon's autos still survive. Although we don't appreciate them now, in his own time they were very popular, and he became well known for crafting exquisite poetry in these succinct plays that were performed in the street at religious celebrations after their initial presentation at court. For many, his work in auto sacramental was the height of the form, as he took them to a new level of complex allegory. He built on the work of Lope de Vega and took them well away from their origins as simple retelling of Bible stories. As he grew older, he turned more to religion, and alongside the auto sacramental, he wrote longer, religiously themed plays, mostly to be presented at court. It may have been not just an aesthetic choice that led him to the religious themes. He seems to have suffered some illness during the Catalonian military expedition and never regained his full strength physically. He was excused further military duties and was in receipt of an apparently intermittent royal pension, which, with the royal commissions for new work, kept him in comfortable circumstances, which was just as well, as these were troubled times for him. The theatres in Madrid were closed for an extended period due to deaths in the royal family. 2 of his brothers were killed, and a love affair ended with a death in childbirth. In 1650, he was ordained to the priesthood and took his vows much more seriously than Lope de Vega ever did. For the last 30 years of his life, he devoted himself to his priestly duties and writing religious plays, principally for the court. But he also had a contract with the city of Madrid to produce 2 auto sacramental annually for the Corpus Christi celebrations. He was working on these for the 1681 celebrations when he died, aged 81. At the time of his death, many regarded Calderon as the superior to Lope de Vega. At the time, there were 3 features that Spanish society stood on firmly: intense religious fervour, a deeply felt national pride, and a growing sense of inequality before the law. Calderon tackled questions relating to these issues in an overtly thoughtful way, and gave those who admired him little reason to dislike him personally. The same couldn't be said for Lope de Vega, whose freewheeling lifestyle and varying positions taken in his plays left him wanting in the eyes of many. Calderon fitted more comfortably with the religiosity of the court of Philip II, and the subsequent rise of the influence of the Church and the power of the Inquisition. The surprise is that he was able to put so much argument and discussion into his plays without censure. His clearly held religious beliefs, loyalty to the king and the court, and public behaviour after some early indiscretions clearly helped. But he also tried to do more than his predecessor had. He matched good and great poetry with attempts at psychological insight and philosophising, and at the very least we have to applaud those attempts. His impact was not as great or as long-lasting as Lope de Vega's, but his work did help to take Spanish theatre forward strongly out of the Renaissance period. Next time, we will still be in the Renaissance period and in Spain, as we take a detailed look at the Spanish playhouse, the chorale, and in particular, the attempt by scholars to understand exactly how the Spanish playhouse worked through the detailed records held on the greatest playhouse of them all, the Chorale de la Príncipe in Madrid. In the meantime, if you would like to support the podcast, there are links in the show notes to ko-fi.com and the Patreon members area. The latest members episode is an introduction to a series that I'm going to run on Konstantin Stanislavski and his autobiography called My Life in Art. It's a fascinating insight into the great practitioner's thoughts and paints a really interesting picture of life in Russia in the early 20th century and his work at the Moscow Arts Theatre. You can get access to that and all the other episodes on Patreon for a small monthly fee, which goes towards offsetting the hosting and research costs that I incur producing the podcast. Thanks everyone for your continued support for the podcast in whatever form. Please do spread the word and help others to find us here. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via Twitter @thoetp.